Herzlich willkommen zu unserem System Matters Podcast. Ich bin Michael Maasberg und darf heute euer Gastgeber sein. Wir sprechen heute nicht nur über Electric Bastionland, sondern vor allem mit der Person, die hinter dem Spiel steckt, mit Chris McDowall. Und bevor ich Chris begrüße, ein kleiner Hinweis und bevor ihr euch wundert, wir führen dieses Interview in Englisch und damit wechsle ich auch jetzt ins Englische. So, hello again, Chris.
Hello.
Thank you for your time. And I mean, before we talk about Electric Bastionland, your wonderful game, what do you want to share about the person Chris McDowall with our listeners?
Well, funnily enough, I was, as you were doing the introduction in German, I speak very little German. I did learn a small amount when I was at school. But in my previous career, before I started working full-time in RPGs, I did have to learn some German for my job.
Oh, okay. What was it?
So the words that I know are trocken, Auslese, Spätlese, Landwein, Tafelwein, because I was a wine importer, essentially.
Okay, good. Is
my
this your
German
failed career?
This is my failed career. Yeah. So I have my pronunciation is probably very poor, but I have a decent lexicon of German wine terms, but it's not very much use when I actually go to Germany and talk to ordinary people.
Hilarious. Cool. Yeah. And I mean, what was the reason that you left wine behind you and moved on to game design?
Well, I mean, really, game design has always been my passion. I very much enjoyed my work that I was doing at the time in the wine industry. And I did enjoy that. But when Electric Bastionland sort of did as well as it did, it was kind of an opportunity for me to, if I did want to try and make a career of designing games, it felt like that was kind of the time for me to try and do it. And that was almost 3 years ago now that I took that plunge. So, yeah, that's It was less a case of leaving my failed career and more a chance of jumping onto a new opportunity.
Oh yeah, great. Yeah, I remember the Kickstarter. Yeah, it was 3 years ago. Yeah, that's true. More or less.
Yeah, it was. Just over 3 years ago was the Kickstarter. Yeah, it was end of 2019.
Yeah, great. So this makes Electric Bastionland actually a very important milestone in your life.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and it's difficult to talk about late 2019 and early 2020 without the obvious kind of global context. So it's kind of weirdly tied up with that whole era for me as well. But yeah, a big kind of shifting point in my life, definitely.
Okay. Before we look deep into Electric Bastionland, I mean, all your new life wouldn't be without what came before it, and this was Into the Odd. This had obviously also a big impact. I just came across an article today where someone made a huge cluster chart about the different OSR rules families, and I think they ended up with 7 clusters, and one cluster was the Odd family.
Yeah.
Maybe some of our listeners don't know it. It would be a shame, but that could happen. What is Into the Odd, and how this came across your life?
So Into the Odd started around, I think I first started writing about the idea of Into the Odd in 2011, I think it was. And this was around the time when there was a lot going on Google Plus to do with sort of particularly the OSR sort of RPG movement that was really kind of exploding at the time. And there were lots of people making their own like sort of twists on D&D, especially kind of basic D&D. And I did enjoy playing in those games, but I never really liked the D&D system, even the kind of basic D&D system. I always wished it was just more simple and it was just more straightforward for how I choose to play the game. That kind of fits better for me. So I originally just started working on, well, I'm going to make my own like hack of D&D, and I'm going to sort of start with a very bare bones basis, a core of original D&D. I'm going to start with that. And that's where the ODD in Into the Odd comes from originally. It was like a silly little joke that this was kind of my version of OD&D, even if it ended up not really being that much from OD&D specifically.
Yeah.
It kind of started as an idea of, well, how much can I remove in terms of rules and still have a fun, engaging game about going into dangerous places and crawling around and, trying not to die and get some treasure and get out. So yeah, and then I started using this game online. I started playing with the people I was playing with on Google Plus at the time. And it just kind of snowballed from there. So it became more of a game with its own identity rather than a D&D hack. And the setting kind of grew out of that as well. But yeah, and then I could keep going until we get to the present day. But that's kind of the start of how Into the Odd started.
Actually, my first contact with the whole odd world was Electric Bastionland. And back in the days, I wasn't really into OSR. Maybe for similar reasons, D&D just didn't click with me. And then looking into Electric Bastionland and later into the Odd, this was kind of the system I was looking for. So thank you for creating this. Moving on at the time with Electric Bastionland, I mean, people obviously asking me, as the person who translated it, what is Electric Bastionland? And normally I say it's awesome, but that's sometimes not enough for people. So,
Sure.
But I'm interested in your elevator pitch for your game.
Yeah, so I've had to do this a lot because when I've been at conventions, people will often come and sort of, if I'm on a stand, people will pick up a book and say, what's this? But I feel like I've never quite got a good elevator pitch, but I'm going to try one now so that this might become the official elevator pitch. So in Electric Bastionland, the game takes place in the city of Bastion, which is this kind of electric era, kind of a functionally infinite city, and everything is here in some shape or form. You yourself, something has gone wrong in your life. So you have two things. You have a failed career behind you, which you might have scraped a few interesting items from or interesting skills. And you have a huge debt, a debt of £10,000 that you owe to somebody who is not going to wait patiently for it. And between these two facts, you have decided to band together to become treasure hunters. And you're going to get enough money to pay off your debt by going somewhere dangerous and bringing back the treasure. But unfortunately, there's lots of weird, dangerous things in your way. And in terms of the game itself, like I've mentioned before, what I tried to do is make it the absolute bare minimum of rules that you need to be able to do that. So it is an ultra light game, but hopefully still rich in the sort of flavor and setting.
I'm convinced. Thank you.
Well, you're an easy sell, really.
Yeah, that's true. But you said it. It's really, really rules light. So I mean, maybe some of our listeners listen to it pre-order or maybe later as well, and still have to make the decision. And I can really say it's great. It's like I think all rules together, not even 10 pages in this 300.
Well, technically, it's if you just want the actual rules of the game, so all the rules for combat and doing dangerous things and dying and all the things your character can do, those all fit on a 2-page spread. And once you've read that 2-page spread, in the inside back cover, I say this is on the English version. I'm sure it's going to be in your version as well. There is a 1-page kind of reference as well. So yeah, my goal was to try and get everything onto 1 page so you can lay the book open if you're running the game, maybe for the first time, and you've got everything that you need in terms of rules straight there on 2 pages.
Yeah, we actually kept the format.
Ah, great.
So it was kind of a bit of a little challenge because... I
had to squeeze every word in to get it onto 2 pages, so that there are times when I was trying to sort of use shorter words just to make sure everything fit.
Yeah.
So doing a translation while maintaining that is probably, it's definitely a difficult ask for you guys.
Yeah, I mean, you know it. In German, we love long sentences with even longer words. So, but we did it, luckily. And this also, we were able to do it because, it's not just the rules. Your whole writing style is kind of minimalistic. So what I really appreciate when I read it for the first time, so it's everything feels like, okay, it's exactly the amount of information that I need to either decide something on the rules side or to get inspired to come up with other things from the setting. And this is, this is something that I really adore about this beautiful book.
Yeah, and that was always my kind of, I mean, I do like sort of big RPG books, and like that's always been something that drew me to RPGs, was that you had like all this world and setting and all these, especially when I was something about, I don't know, when I was a teenager, I was kind of drawn to the idea of like really complicated rules because it felt like I was playing like the grown-up game. But yeah, as I've gotten older, I think I've gotten more impatient and more kind of, yeah, like you say, I like books that tell me just enough to get the idea flowing, and especially in an RPG, because I think one of the most important skills when you're running an RPG is at some point you're going to have to start making stuff up, because at some point the players are going to ask you a question that you don't know the answer to. So my sort of philosophy is that I want to get the person who's running the game, I want them to kind of have to start making stuff up almost straight away and just filling the gaps a little bit, just so they can get into the practice of that and get comfortable improvising and kind of generating their own ideas around these kind of sparks that are in the book. And then when they do get a really difficult question asked, they've had the warm up and they're more kind of prepared to handle that.
I also love big and rich books, but they not always come in very handy at the table sometimes. And
yeah.
And then you're flipping pages looking for a detail that can become really a showstopper. But going back to Electric Bastionland, I mean, Into the Odd, which was re-released last year as a remastered edition, but compared to Electric Bastionland is Into the Odd a small book, thin book. So what was your main idea to for Electric Bastionland? Was it to expand the world?
Yeah, so I was pretty happy with the rules in Into the Odd, and I didn't want to just make sort of Into the Odd 2, like new edition, because I was happy with how that game was. So originally I was kind of thinking, well, I want to do like just a big source book for the world, because the setting in Into the Odd originally was kind of a little bit of an afterthought, because I just wanted it to be a place where you could put your own ideas in there. So it's very open. So things like how you've got just the one city of Bastion. So if you've got any idea for like an urban thing, you can find a place to put it somewhere in Bastion. And the fact that you've got deep country, which goes on forever. And parts of deep country are like going back in time. So if you've got like an idea for a medieval or Renaissance or like ancient feeling game, you can say, well, this is happening out in deep country. And while they started as kind of game conceits, really, I really liked the way that this world started to kind of feel, and it did start to develop its own kind of identity by the time I'd finished with Into the Odd. So I originally thought, well, I should do like a supplement, not necessarily like a book of lore, because I didn't want to give lots of answers. I wanted to give more ideas. And as I started to come up with ideas for that, it kind of shifted into this idea of, well, I do want to share this world with people, but I still want this book to be a game. I still want it to be a self-contained game in its own right. And I want it to be so you can use material from both games with each other. And it's the same world in like two slightly different eras. So yeah, I reached a point where I just thought, well, no, Electric Bastionland is going to be a game as well. And the way I decided to get the world across, the thing that clicked for me when I sort of knew that I had a sense of what this book was going to be like, was when I thought, well, what if you described the world, a large part of the world, through the characters themselves, rather than having a big list of places, having just a big list of potential characters that you might be, and each of those characters tells you something about the world. So that's what happened with the failed careers in Electric Bastionland. So everyone that starts the game starts with one of, there's just over 100 different failed careers in the book. And it was a slightly risky idea, but I decided each one of them would have a full spread in the book with a big piece of art and lots of different options for the stuff that you start with, and answers to the question of, well, what happened to you in your failed career? I still have to kind of keep saying this, because I do get the odd person that sort of asks, well, so I'll roll my character, then I'll never look in that section of the book again, right? And I have to say, well, no, this is the book. This is where a lot of the world exists. And if you're running the game, you can open to a random page in the book, And if you're in the failed career section, you might get something like, let's have a look, the pie smuggler I've just opened up onto. And I could use the names from here. I can find ideas in the artwork. I have ideas for equipment that this character might have. I have a company that this person owes a debt to that I could be using as a protagonist. So I wanted each page to kind of simultaneously give you something for your character when you start the game, but also be a sort of library of resources for when you are actually running the game as well.
This is something that I really love about the book, and I couldn't say that I have seen something similar in a different game, and it works, like you say, when you run it with random people at a convention and they just roll the characters and they immediately have an understanding and a feeling, not just for the character, but also for the world. And I also, sometimes I use it for different games, and they are also a bit weirder or more, have a, let's say, surreal or odd approach to it, and just pick a D100 and use this as an NPC, and this is a really great resource. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's great. And I think that's part of the reason that I don't have a really good elevator pitch for the game is that when I'm actually running the game, like you've said, I just like to get the players to roll a character straight away. Because if we each roll a character and then we each tell the rest of the group, well, here's what my character is and here's what I have, you almost don't need to then tell the players much more about the setting because they will have worked out a lot just from the context of who these characters are. And that was something that people would often tell me about Into the Odd, was that they enjoyed that. So yeah, it was kind of an idea of taking that to the extreme.
Well done. Talking about failed careers, this is also a question that came up from our community. Do you have a favorite?
I can't say that I have a favorite. I think the one that always sticks in my mind, and I think it's because it reminds me of a particular moment when I was making the book, is the science mystic. Because when I wrote that, it was kind of a twist on the idea of, I don't know if they have it in modern D&D, but in like 3rd edition D&D, there was a mystic theurge or something, where if you were like a cleric and a wizard, it was like a weird multi-class prestige class that I think was no good, but I always liked it was slightly ridiculous, this idea that you would be trying to like study both of these things at once. So yeah. It was inspired by that, and it was like, well, there's not really like magic in this world. So what if it's someone who splits between like science and mysticism? And I wrote that, and I had all this planned out, but then Alex Sorensen, who did the artwork, it was one of the first illustrations that he came back to me with. I think I sent him like 10 and said, look, let's do 10 first, 10 failed careers. And I'll sort of give you some feedback, and we'll make sure we get the tone right before you kind of dig into the rest. And the science mystic, when it came back, was completely different to how I was picturing it. But straight away, I knew it sort of looked right. And it was like the moment that I knew Alec had a really clear, like really interesting, like vision for how this was going to look. So that one's definitely got a kind of a place in my heart for sure.
Oh, cool. Before we talk about Alec, it's funny. We did another podcast for Sister Matters where we were talking about the translation. We test rolled a character, and it was this failed career.
Ah, okay.
that came up. Yeah, you already mentioned Alex Sorensen, and I mean, it is his art was also one of the selling points for me to back this book, and it's really amazing. I love his style, and it's really great that this one artist who designed everything, and I think he really has an impact on this book, and his also kind of minimalistic style fits very well to the setting. How did you find him?
I think I have to give credit here, because when I was looking for an illustrator for Electric Bastionland, there was a little bit of a turbulent time where I had sort of some people I was talking to, but then some things didn't work out, and it reached a point where I was getting a little bit nervous that I wasn't necessarily going to find someone, and it was and I knew that I wanted one person to do the whole book, because I knew that I wanted it to be like one person's vision in terms of the actual artwork, and someone that could really kind of come in and like collaborate and contribute to the world. And I think in one of my many moments of desperation, I messaged Patrick Stewart, who is the writer of various RPG things like Deep Carbon Observatory, Veins of the Earth, and various other things. And I think I contacted Patrick and said, oh, by the way, do you know any really interesting artists that have grabbed your attention recently? And he sent me a huge list. And I think one of them was Alec. And that was the initial kind of clue that I got that eventually led into me getting in touch with him and us making it work.
How much of freedom had he in his designs or in designing the careers? I mean, his images are also very rich with some hints in the details. That there's still artwork in this book after years where I spot interesting detail in the background. And I'm like, oh wow, this is something that I want to include in my next game. And how much of this was your vision and his vision?
Well, I kind of gave him the worst of both worlds because he's told me he was very happy with this direction, but I still feel slightly guilty about this. So I said to him that I wanted him to, like, you know, have lots of freedom and just try things out. And I didn't want to give him specific briefs for each piece of work. And I know some artists would either love that or hate that in terms of having such a kind of broad brief for the work. So I gave him lots of like ideas of like the tone of the world and just kind of the feel of things. And the failed careers were already completely written. So I said, like, if you're struggling, just look through like the bits of equipment that are on the failed career and just kind of put some people in like with that equipment in the background. And one of the two kind of big influences that I wanted to try and get into the artwork were, if you know the painter L.S. Lowry, who painted a lot of kind of industrial, like paintings of like industrial England around like the early 20th century. And some of his famous paintings, they weren't all in this style, but some of them were in this style of almost like, they called them like matchstick men. So like lots of little tiny people in a kind of crowd scene and lots of detail. And the other thing that I wanted to bring in was, again, I'm sure you have this in Germany. You have like Where's Wally books, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not so much for it to look like one of those books, because I always loved them when I was a kid. And the thing that I loved was, like you say, just like looking through for details. And even when you found Wally, it's just like fun to look through and see little stories happening in the background. And yeah, they were the two kind of things that I kind of pointed at and said, I really want to have that kind of feel. And it's interesting because in the first few pieces that Alex sent through, I think he was probably sort of testing the water in terms of like what he could put in there. So they were very good, but as the process went on, he started to get a little bit more wild and experimental with like just weird looking people in the background and like weird things happening. And yeah, I gave him lots of direction, like just have like animals in the background, like that you wouldn't expect to see in a city. So in one, there's like a lion just sitting on top of a building. And I wanted lots of things that kind of begged questions when you looked at it. Like, why is this lion here? Does somebody like own this lion, or is this lion like an independent person almost that lives in the city? So yeah, that it was very much, I have to give lots and lots and lots of credit to Alec for sort of the delivery on that, because it was a difficult brief, I think, from me.
Yeah, I can imagine. And how long was this process?
Well, because of some of the issues, like I said in the kind of process, he made these very quickly. I think it was just a few months. I think he came on board like maybe a month before the Kickstarter, maybe 2 months before the Kickstarter. And I had the text all written. The Kickstarter was kind of there to fund the art and the print, essentially. So he came on, pretty early, just before the Kickstarter, and was just sending me stuff every day, like while the Kickstarter was happening. So I was just like receiving all this artwork as the Kickstarter was happening and trying to just share it with people to show how good it was going to look. Yeah, it was a really quite intense time.
Cool. Yeah. It feels like a great addition to your writing. Everything is a little bit like, sometimes for me, it's like a puzzle game without knowing the final image. And while I putting pieces in place, I realized that a large part of the pieces are missing. Yeah. And then I start to draw my own images or connecting the lines. And his artwork, again, is really a great source of inspiration, but also to understanding the oddness of this world.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like you say, it's sort of the visual equivalent of what I'm asking people to do to fill some of the gaps in their mind, and also just having sometimes I said that I wanted lots of detail, but if you've got if the whole 2-page spread is just crammed with detail, it's sort of too much. So it is a fine line, and part of like the layout was very consciously that there was quite a lot of kind of white space on the page, like sort of to allow the words and the art to kind of really sink into your brain as you read through it. And yeah, even within the artwork, there's quite often ones that have a kind of a space where, like you say, you could almost imagine continuing the piece of artwork into that space if you wanted.
Yeah. You're also writing in the book that it's a game for people who love role-playing games, but maybe are hating playing with wizards and dwarfs and more the classical characters. Sure. So let's say, why the electric in Bastionland? What was the thing that really interested you into bringing it into this unusual era?
I do like games with, more classic fantasy things, but there are just so many. So I thought that there's no point me doing one because there are so many that are doing this. And I wanted to do something a bit different. And I knew that I wanted there to be elements of kind of a little bit of horror and a little bit of weirdness and a little bit of humor as well. These are all things that really appeal to me about a setting. And all those things work a little bit better in my experience, if the world itself is a little bit more relatable, because horror is often really effective if it's combined with like a relatable setting. Like, the obvious like classic horror film is kind of somebody in a house on their own, like that looks like your house. And that makes it more scary. And same with like weirdness. If everything is weird, it's sort of like your brain almost doesn't like absorb it because it's just like, I don't know what's weird in this world and what's not. Whereas if the world is like a lot of very relatable stuff, but then a lot of weird stuff as well, the weird stuff feels more weird. And same with the humor as well. Like when you have a kind of relatable world, it's easier to have bits of humor that don't feel kind of completely out of place. So all those things, wanting to have a more relatable world sort of pushed me towards, well, what if I made this sort of, because Into the Odd was sort of implied to be around a kind of industrial revolution era. So maybe like early 19th century, maybe, or late 18th century. But for Electric Bastionland, I thought, well, let's push it forward and take it even further. And the implication is that it's kind of early 20th century is the very, very rough guide. And I wanted to keep it rough so that if you wanted to include something from, something that wasn't invented until 1960 or 1970, you can do it, just make it look a little bit old fashioned. And the reason for that is I feel like that's a really ripe era to draw on because you've got a lot of relatable things, like people are generally working jobs that aren't a million miles away from, you haven't got like people who are serfs and like peasants and things that it's very difficult to relate to as a kind of person living today. You got people that have jobs and they have bosses and they have colleagues and they have a house that they pay for and they have to pay the electricity bill and they go to the shop to buy things. Like these all sound very obvious, but there's a lot of kind of fantasy worlds where those things just don't happen. Like you think about like Lord of the Rings and it's like, well, what do people do as a job? What's a normal person doing as a job in Lord of the Rings, and how can I relate to that? So I wanted to have something relatable, and setting it in that kind of early electric era, like early 20th century. Also, you don't get so modern that you have to worry about things like things not feeling right, because I wanted it to feel like that kind of exciting early electric era. Rather than being a kind of alternative today, I wanted it to be like an alternative just a few yesterdays ago, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Totally. And are there some specific sources you've drawn your inspiration from?
It's more of just an overall kind of feel of like what, because it's the closest era that is kind of still within our kind of cultural memory. That might be complete nonsense. But what I mean is like, this feels like a world that like our grandparents could have existed in potentially. And like, and I knew my grandparents when I was growing up. So I have a kind of direct link to a lot of the kind of little things that are in this world. I have like a kind of a secondhand link to those things, but they aren't necessarily things that are sort of still completely relevant to today. So I just try and like take everyday things and just kind of try and put a twist on them. People often ask like if I would write like an appendix N for my games, where it's like a list of books and films and stuff. But to be honest, I really, I love watching films and I do read the odd book, but I'm not very good at finishing novels. But I don't always draw like huge influence from them. Certainly for this book, it was more just kind of a world that grew out of out of making the game and just looking around me and just kind of letting it happen. This sounds very pretentious, but this is this is really the kind of process for how I ended up there.
It's fine. I can totally relate to it, and I think this is also what makes Electric Bastionland and the whole setting so unique and special. It feels like a kind of self-contained world that makes sense without making sense sometimes, but that has unique and strong feeling to it.
And because so much of the world is baked into these failed careers, a lot of those are drawn from kind of like experiences that I kind of have had or have heard people tell me about. So I just opened the page now to the small town refugee who's kind of someone who's come from the kind of a rural environment and they've moved to the big city, which is kind of like how I felt when I moved from a rural environment to a big city. So a lot of these things are kind of, based on personal experience. Although I have just opened up to the exposed imposter, and I'm hoping that's not going to be something that is a part of my life.
There's one thing, what I love about the setting is this crazy bureaucracy of this city. And this is something I can relate to. This is my personal dungeon is sometimes German bureaucracy. Sure. And this fine things that makes this setting really relatable with all the other stuffs that we have, like mockeries running around or aliens from outer space.
Yeah.
As I mentioned them, what is the reason for the mockeries and aliens? Why did you decide to use them? I mean, machineries, they make sense. This is like Electric Bastionland, but why mockeries? Why aliens?
Yeah, I knew that I wanted I wanted the city to mainly feel like kind of a human world. I wasn't interested in making like my own version of like elves and dwarves to put in this world. That there's enough variety within humanity, I think, to do that kind of stuff anyway, especially in a kind of huge metropolitan city like Bastion. So I knew that I wanted some ideas in there for if you wanted like a non-human either antagonist or just like a contact. So yeah, the machines, like you say, are kind of an obvious one because electric is in the title. So it's like, well, what if there are these kind of almost artificial intelligences in the world? Mockeries, it's a really stupid thing, but I grew up really loving the movie Muppet Christmas Carol, which is kind of, it's exactly what it is. If you've not seen it, you know from the name. But I would always like joke with my sister when we watched it at Christmas, like, well, how does this world work? You've got like pigs walking around who are Muppets, and these are presumably pigs with jobs. And then you've got actual animals walking around in the city as well. So it's like, in this world, do people know that these characters are Muppets and they're not human and they're distinct from the real animals of the world? I think I just wrote it as like a silly idea in a blog post once. And then I kept coming back to it. And I eventually reached a point where I was like, you know what? I'm going to put them in this setting because I felt like I shouldn't because it was too silly, but I thought this is something that feels very close to my heart. So I'm going to put them in there. So yeah, they are essentially kind of like animal Muppets brought to life. And that's why they're in there.
Thank you for putting them in.
Oh, and the aliens are less well defined. And the idea of having aliens is, again, it's another kind of game conceit that grew into a setting thing, because I knew in this world, just to kind of differentiate from like sort of fantasy, I thought, well, I don't want to have like your classic idea of all these specific religions within the city. I wanted it to be like, well, there's lots and lots of little kind of cults and temples and things, and that it's not that you need to learn what these religions are, but a lot of them are focused around the stars and just the general vague idea that there is like power in the stars themselves. And I hinted at there being like aliens in Into the Odd. Usually if there was like a weird creature or something, I might have hinted, oh, this is a creature from the stars. And I thought, well, if we've got all these weird alien like monsters coming down, surely there'd be some that are more like alien people or anywhere in between. So they are very kind of broadly defined and left very much open to interpretation, but it's generally there if you want to have a non-human character. The fact that there are aliens in the city means that you've got sort of permission to go wild, and if you want to make them very unusual, you can make them an alien.
Nice. You already mentioned your blog, and also do a little shout out for your blog. So if you listen to this and you don't know it, bastionland.com is the place to go, and it's really rich resource for everything. I really enjoyed to randomly pick a year and a month and read an article. And it's really surprising what you can find there. How much of this went into Electric Bastionland and the addendum?
Oh, lots and lots of it. So anything that was on the blog that I did use, I at least kind of polished it up a little bit to make it fit in the book. But I kind of wanted that. So the addendum at the back of the book is essentially a bank of little I wanted it to be like mini essays almost talking about the game. So some of them are talking about the world. Some of them are talking about how to run the game. Some of them are talking about the kind of design behind the game. But I wanted these to all be like optional things because I wanted, if you're running the game, I wanted it to be clear that you don't need to read all this stuff. This isn't how you learn the game. This is like DVD extra material that you, if you like the game, you will find really useful. Or if you're looking for an answer to something, it might be tucked away in there. But yeah, I wanted it to feel like a kind of little sampler of the stuff that I'd written on the blog and all of the stuff that was kind of pertinent to this game. So I would imagine at least kind of half of it at least started on the blog, and maybe the remaining 50% was like new stuff that was written specifically for the book in that section.
A really useful section, even if you're not running Electric Bastionland, which you should, but there you find a lot of insights. It's a nice bridge to some of the community questions. So before we look into other things that you're doing and developing,
yeah, sure.
I would quickly talk about these. But there was one question, because people who are pre-ordering the book now, they already have access to the PDF, and we receive a very good feedback also for this section. And someone asked if there are any plans to compile all of your tips or most of it from your blog, videos, or book into a kind of general GM guide.
Yeah, this is something that I've been asked about before, and I think I could see myself doing that at some point further down the road. For now, it's not something that I'm planning on doing, but I think it's probably only a matter of time until I think about doing something like that. But for now, I'm more interested in I like the idea of games that are kind of, have this thing about how each book should kind of be a complete self-contained thing. Mm-hmm. So that if you just buy that book, you feel like you're getting the full thing. It's not like you buy that and then you're like, well, I'll go and buy this supplement as well. And should I buy this DM's guide? So I think eventually I will probably look at that. But for now, I'm quite enjoying just trying to fit as much of that stuff into the game itself, if that makes sense. Yeah,
totally. But count me in if you produce such a book.
Yeah, I'm definitely not against the idea, but I think that'll be something for in a little while.
Yeah. Talking about your tools and advice, there's another question. Which is for you the most useful, or let's say central GM tool and advice in the Electric Bastionland addendum?
I think there's kind of two for this that I would really recommend. So for all that I said, that you don't need to read the addendum, there's maybe two parts of it that I think are really worth looking at. To be fair, these parts that I'm going to say are actually in the conductor's guide as well. Mm-hmm. But I think that the first one is this idea of what I call the ICI doctrine, which is information, choice, and impact. I think when I kind of reached the conclusion of having those three things in order as it's like the core of what I do when I'm running the game. And I found it to be really useful to remember, where you need to make sure you're giving enough information to the players. And then you need to make sure that whatever situation you're in, the players have got some kind of choice, that they're not just being pushed along. And then when they do make a choice, you need to make sure that the choice has impact. And I think all of the games that I think back on where I've gone maybe to a convention and played in a game and not really enjoyed it, usually it comes down to one of those things not working. It comes down to, well, I felt like I wasn't given enough information, or it felt like I sat through the whole game and I didn't make a single choice, or it might have felt like there was no impact. Everything I did just kind of happened, and then the game carried on going without it kind of feeling like I was having an impact. So I would read that, because I think that's for me is the thing that is often at the forefront of my mind when I'm running the game. And the other tool in here that I probably use the most is the Spark tables. I knew that I wanted it to be random tables in here. And into the odd, I had a lot of tables that were like big D100 tables, just like your kind of classic list of maybe not 100 things, but rolling a D100 and looking down to find a specific answer to a thing, like what's around this corner. And I would make a list of things so that if you were exploring the city, you could roll a D100 and find what's around the corner. But in Electric Bastionland, because I wanted to make it more about encouraging improvisation and encouraging the conductor to kind of make the world their own, I had spark tables, which instead of having lots of kind of very clear, definitive answers, you would instead roll 2d20, and that will give you sort of 2 words that might come together to make something. So for the city of Bastion itself, there's a spark table here that has 2 columns of 20 things, and I might roll and get, so I just got Dirty University, which is slightly unfortunate, so we'll move on. And then if you roll again, you might have got something like Pastry Graveyard.
Yeah.
And you can take it very literally and say, oh, it's a pastry graveyard. Or you can start to think, well, these are 2 elements of the city. How might they come together? Maybe this is a place that it's a patisserie, perhaps, that specifically makes like funeral pastries that are like all black. And it's a very kind of somber shop that sort of has this kind of death mourning themed pastry. And I wanted the players to be able to come up with those kind of ideas themselves and feel like they were making their own version of the world. So the spark tables for me are the thing that I probably use the most for things like that.
Oh, yeah. Also great fan of those. Another question that we have with all your ideas into games, you mentioned it with Into the Odd that you started it, testing it at Google Plus back in the days. How do you test your ideas, games? Are you testing them?
I understand that it's difficult for some people to test their games just because of their personal circumstances. And I'm not going to say that it's like essential that you have to test a game for it to work. But I've always found that when I do test one of my games, especially early on in the process, I always kind of leave that playtest thinking with a giant list of things I want to either change or expand on, or even just things that work really well. You might kind of stumble onto something that you put in there thinking it was a very small thing, but it ended up being really important to the game. And then you can kind of make that more central to the design of the game. So I do test at the moment. I think because we were stuck playing online for so long, at the moment I haven't done much online play. I'm much more interested in playing in person now. So I've got a few groups of guinea pigs who are often quite happy to test something out, as long as I don't test their patience too much with it. But I try and kind of do my tests in person now. Yeah,
great. But it is also actually a play test for your next project, Mystic Bastionland. Right.
Yeah, so Mythic Bastionland, I've put out a sort of document for that as it stands. Because, playtesting it myself is one thing, but it's the real test is if somebody else picks it up and I give them no further input. They just take the rules as they're written and tries to run the game. That's like the real test as to whether it's going to work or not. It's been good. It's still early days for Mythic Bastionland, but it's definitely something I want to keep on working on for sure. But yeah, the sort of elevator pitch with Mythic Bastionland is if Electric Bastionland was a game about kind of going around a city and going into dangerous places, I wanted to do a game that was more about the 2 things I really wanted to do is dip into sort of the idea of wilderness exploration and travel and have a kind of really kind of at the opposite of kind of the urban feeling game of Electric Bastionland. And also one that kind of dipped into myths and kind of legends and kind of mythology. The idea is that if you walk away from, or if you drive away from Bastion and go into deep country, the idea is that often it's like going back in time. So if you went down the right road in the right direction at the right time of day, perhaps you could end up in a past that didn't actually exist. So it's kind of set in the kind of the mythic past of Bastion rather than the real past of Bastion. And it's kind of a world that exists in the kind of almost the creation myth of Electric Bastionland. It sounds very pretentious when I phrase it like that, but the essence of it is it's not that you're playing in the history of this world, you're playing in the mythology of this world, which may not necessarily be real, but somehow you ended up there.
Okay, that's cool. Do you know already when you're planning to release or finish it?
I would love to finish it as soon as I can. With these things, it's hard to predict.
Yeah.
It's my main kind of focus this year, to be honest with you. So by the end of the year, I would at least like to know when I'm going to be kickstarting it, or maybe if I can work really hard, maybe get it ready to kickstart it at the very end of the year.
Oh, okay. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, fingers crossed for sure.
Yeah, a few more questions. With talking about the playtest, was this something about Electric Bastionland that you wanted to put in, but then you realized through testing that the concept maybe does not fit really?
Yeah, so originally when I was writing this book, and it kind of had the code name like Oddworld Supplement or something, and I went in and I wrote a big list of things I wanted to put in there, and a lot of them were going to be like new little rule systems. So I was like, oh, there should be something for like leading an expedition on like a boat and managing your crew. And there should be something about like, what if you do get your hands on like a spaceship somehow and you're able to actually go into the stars? And, you know, that there should be an expanded version of the rules for like running your own business. And every time I put them in, they just kind of sat there, and some people might have sort of said like, oh yeah, that's interesting, but it wasn't kind of feeding the main core of the game for me. And a lot of those things I sort of chopped out. And at the top of the document, when I was writing the game, at the very top of the kind of Word document that I was using, I had 3 things. Number 1, I'll phrase it carefully. I'll give you the PG rating of this phrase rather than the 18 plus rating that I actually had in there. It was stop adding stuff, because I felt like the temptation is always there to add stuff, and like, well, this has got to be in there. And I would joke with people that I'm writing advanced into the odd. It's going to have rule systems for everything. And I had to kind of keep making myself stop that. And the second one was make the main thing the main thing. So it is essentially a game about going into potentially a dungeon or some kind of weird place, or maybe just a weird corner of the city or a weird corner of the country, trying to find treasure and get out. So I shifted all of that weird distraction stuff that I'd put in there and really kind of tried to channel the game into the focus of, no, you are going to try and find treasure. And that's how I ended up on things like giving the characters a big debt, because that kind of drives home the idea that getting some money is like the absolute number 1 priority in this game.
And it's pretty relatable as a motivation to go on a treasure hunt. Some of the things that you cut out, they ended up on your blog, right? Oh,
yeah. So often if I do have an idea like that for like a weird subsystem. So I did, at some point I did write a little mini rule set for like having a crew and a ship and trying to sort of keep it afloat. And I love putting that kind of thing on the blog, because I like that someone might, even if they don't use it themselves, it might just get an idea running where they think, oh, well, I could run that kind of game with Electric Bastionland or with Into the Odd. And I think that's the best place for it, because when it's on the blog, it's very clear that you don't need this for the game. Mm-hmm. But I think when you put it in the game book, sometimes it like muddies the waters for the people who are reading it. And I like to keep the book focused so that the blog can just be whatever silly idea comes into my head that week.
Yeah, nice. Yet another question about things that didn't make it into the game, and not just one, but a few persons asked, why did you decide against a more classic magic system with spells and so on for your games?
Well, I think when I made the move to kind of, so this kind of started with Into the Odd, I guess, because when I moved to kind of the idea of the setting being more kind of industrial era and maybe drawing a little bit more on elements of sci-fi and elements of horror, it kind of felt like you shouldn't have a character in there that kind of has all these weird powers themselves. It feels like the characters should be a little bit more mundane in themselves, but there should still be weird things existing in the world. So rather than having spells that you learn, I decided to have arcana or oddities, depending on whether you're playing Into the Odd or Electric Bastionland. In Electric Bastionland, they're called oddities, which are weird items that do a very specific thing. And they're very much inspired by those kind of magic items that you would always hope you would find in D&D. So the opposite of sort of the +2 sword. Things like the decanter of endless water, or the immovable rod, or the portable hole. All these things that just did a really weird thing. They weren't necessarily there to help you in combat directly, but they would make you try and think of weird plans for how to use it. So I wanted to put lots of those items in there, and I wanted it to be that every character could engage with that. So you don't have the problem like you get in D&D, where if you're the fighter, you just don't really get to engage with this huge section of the book to do with spells. Anyone can kind of find one of these items, and anybody can use them. So yeah, that was the idea, really.
Was it also decision based on your overall design goal to keep it really as simple as possible?
Yeah, because the idea with these, and I did originally have a rule system for it. So I had a thing where like different oddities would have a power level, and you had to like pass a test to be able to use it safely, and you had to like attune yourself to it, and there was only so many you could carry. But eventually I just kept chopping that away until there was nothing left. So now they're just things that just work. So if you have, let me think of one. There's one that's the bone magnet is the one that I always think of.
Yeah.
So the bone magnet is presumably a big magnet, and it attracts anything that has a skeleton. Anything that has bones, you can either attract or repel it. And that's pretty much the extent of the rules for that item. It doesn't have a power level. It doesn't have like a mana cost or anything like that. It just does that. And this means you have to be very careful when you write them, because if you make one that's too useful, like in too many situations, it kind of becomes, it's like fun to begin with, but then when it becomes like the universal solution to everything, it becomes a little bit of a problem. And I like giving players very powerful things, but I always want to keep it just before you get to that point where it's too universally useful. So they're often like weirdly specific in their use, or if they are very powerful, perhaps they need like there's a weird limitation on when you can use it, or it consumes something in requirement for it to be used.
And these requirements also add wonderfully to the weirdness of the setting, which is a nice bridge to the next question. What is your personal fascination about or for weird fantasy and all the odd stuff in general?
I think it's very difficult to come up with something kind of new that nobody has heard of before. So I think I would never try and sort of do that. But what I do like is that sense of surprise that you see with people. And that's why almost one of my favorite bits of the game, almost always, when I'm playing Electric Bastionland with a new group, is rolling the characters, because they don't know what to expect. And they roll a few dice and they get a few ability scores. And then I say, okay, so that means you've got failed career. So I've opened it up here to number 29B, and you are a mendicant mycologist. So you are like a mushroom lover, basically. You study fungus, and you might start with, a really strange type of mushroom that absorbs light when you cut it open. And you might start with one of the other things that you might get is, let me have a look. Might obviously have some psychedelic mushrooms. You might have just a map to somewhere strange, and you have a mushroom cap that you wear. And it's always fun seeing that surprise on people's face when you tell them what their character is, when they're perhaps coming into this blind expecting something a bit more like, well, you're a fighter or you're a thief or you're a ranger. So I think I just like seeing that surprise. And it's a fine line where you don't want it to be so silly that somebody laughs at it and then they're like, okay, that was a good joke, but now what's my character for real? The sweet spot is when I know that it's a good one, is when people laugh and then they're excited to sort of use this character and to see where this goes and to see how they can use this weird item that they've got.
This is very true. Yeah. I think I have one last one.
Yeah.
This is, I think, role-playing gamers are always interested in the next new thing. What other RPGs are you playing privately? Is it just your games or other games as well?
So I do have to I have to sort of make myself go out and play other RPGs, because the temptation is when I get a group together to play an RPG, I've usually got something I want to test. So weirdly, this year so far, I've been playing a lot of like miniature tabletop games. So I could talk about that all day. But in terms of RPGs, I think the most recent one I played was probably, there's a little mini series of games called 2400, which are these, it's by Jason Tocci, and it's this set of kind of, there's like, I think 10 or 12 games. When you buy it, you get this whole set of 10 or 12 little mini games that all use the same rules. And each of the games fits on a little one-page that you just fold in half. So like just a folded piece of paper that has everything you need on it for that game. And they're all these kind of like gritty, lo-fi sci-fi, he calls it. And it's a very minimal package, but it gives you there's a lot of like random tables and things packed into these little leaflets. So I've been really enjoying playing around with them because it's a really good, what I've actually been doing is running it and not preparing at all. Almost as a little challenge to myself to kind of see how much of this world can we just generate by rolling on tables as we play. So yeah, if you've not tried those out, that's a really fun challenge to try as a GM. So yeah, that's 2400 by Jason Tocci.
Oh yeah, I know them. I found them itch.io.
Yes,
they're available, and they're really, really lovely, and they can be very challenging, but for a GM, but also a good lesson in improvisation.
Yeah, it's one of those fun challenges. You get some RPGs that are a challenge in a bad way because you feel like you're trying to sort of hold a house together in a storm, keep all the systems in place. But the system itself is very simple. That the challenge comes from sort of doing your best GMing that you possibly can with this kind of minimal framework.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I just realized I skipped one topic in the notes. You talked about miniature games, and obviously your blog is also full of examples of your love for these tabletop war games. What's your fascination about these games? And on the other hand, why don't they matter in Electric Bastionland?
I think it's weird because I love miniature games and I love role-playing games, but I kind of like them to be kind of one or the other. I'm not a huge fan of games that exist in that middle ground where it's an RPG, but you sometimes stop to play like a skirmish miniature game. Mm-hmm. Again, I like to sort of keep the main thing. But in spite of that, the war games that I do like are the ones that when you finish it, you've got a story that kind of happened in the game without even having to try. Like, it's not that you've named the characters or you've rolled like character traits for them. It's just the stuff that happened on the table was unexpected and exciting. Yeah. So I love the kind of, I'm really enjoying the kind of modeling and painting aspect as well. But yeah, what I really like is the idea that you come together with another person and you play this game where you are being competitive, but you're also collaborating to like make a story happen. And that it's a nice twist on kind of what I get out of RPGs. It kind of scratches the same itch from like a slightly different angle.
What's your favorite games?
Well, I'm really bad for, because I kind of come back into this in the last few years. I've got so many on my shelf that I haven't played, but I want to play. This weekend I have played, I actually went and had a little bit of a marathon session with some friends. We played Xenos Rampant, which is a game through Osprey. Mm-hmm. I played Bolt Action for the first time, which I know is a very well-known game, but I hadn't played it until now, and I very much enjoyed it. And obviously I'm always trying to test some games of my own. So we played around with a mech game that I've been working on called Mac Attack, which is kind of my take on, again, how minimal can you make the rules for something like BattleTech so you can still have big giant walking battle mechs fighting each other and stomping on infantry and so on. But yeah, I've got a whole shelf of games that I need to work through in so little time.
Yeah, I can relate to this. You're also planning to publish Mac Attack at one point, or is it more like a side project?
It's in that weird possibility space where I like it a lot. I don't know if it's going to be something that gets published, but at the moment it's free to download. It's only a few pages long, the rules. It's on the site, but well, I've written a game called The Doomed, which is a kind of skirmish game that's going to be released this year through Osprey. So that's the one that I've got coming out next in terms of miniature games. But yeah, you never know. Mac Attack might be something else that happens a little bit further down the line. Okay.
I will definitely keep an eye on that. And, who knows? I mean, you, brought me into OSR. Maybe you will also get me into tabletop games.
I would feel guilty if that was the case, because it is it's a dangerous hobby to get into if you enjoy having disposable income.
Yeah, but on the other hand, you know, also collecting comics and stuff. But
sure, yeah.
I have
it's too late for you.
Many dangerous hobbies. Yes, this is then my personal maybe reason for debts is the overachieving collector.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Chris, for all these insights.
No, it's a pleasure.
Already a little bit longer than originally planned, and I hope the listeners enjoyed it as much as I did. I mean, when I did the translation, it's already also a few years ago, I mean, with all these things that happened in between. So it's really a pleasure to finally speaking to you.
Yeah, definitely.
not just writing. And yeah, again, if you're looking for other inspirations or more material or some rules that didn't make it into a book, but it might be interesting for your campaign, check out bastionland.com. There's Chris' blog and all other materials like the Mythic Bastionland playtest and Mech Attack for you to test it. And Chris, any last advice for people who want to explore Bastion?
I think the main thing to know with this setting is I wanted it to be one of those settings where you can't really do it wrong. So my version of Bastionland is very much inspired by my experiences, and I've put some of that into the book. But if your nearest city is different to my nearest city, so if you're growing up in, Munich or Berlin or Kuala Lumpur or Tokyo or anywhere, I always love it when I hear people drawing on their experiences for the world and really making it their own. So I always try, and whenever I get a chance, really give people the kind of encouragement to do the world however they want it and to not worry about doing it wrong.
Great. Awesome. So thanks again. And I'm switching back to German, and maybe you want to listen in and test.
Yeah, I'll see how well I can do.
Not talking about wine, so let's see. Das war unser Podcast mit Chris McDowall, dem kreativen Kopf hinter Electric Bastionland. Und wann immer du diese Episode hörst, ist Electric Bastionland vielleicht noch weiterhin in der Vorbestellung. Dann hast du die Gelegenheit auch noch Zusatzmaterial zu bekommen, weil wir noch ein Abenteuer von Chris übersetzen und auch noch ein schriftliches Interview mit ihm haben, das wir reinpacken. Und wenn nicht, dann, und du hörst diese Folge später, dann gibt es dieses wundervolle Buch einfach schon ganz regulär zu kaufen. Und wir legen es dir sehr am Herzen. Und damit verabschieden wir uns. Einen schönen Morgen, Tag oder Abend, wann immer du dich befindest.
Intro und Outro wurden von Kirk Osamayo gemacht. Und zwar findet man das Stück On a Blimp, die Ambient-Variante, im Album Season 1. Und das Ganze steht unter Creative Commons Lizenz. Vielen Dank fürs Zuhören und wir hören uns beim nächsten Mal wieder. Bis dann. Tschüss.